Welcome to the IT free training video on how DNS data is stored in Active Directory partitions. Understanding how this works will help you understand how DNS data stored in Active Directory is replicated. It will also increase your understanding of how Active Directory partitions work, in particular how application partitions work. Before I get started on how DNS data is stored in Active Directory, I will first have a look at the Active Directory partitions. Let's consider a typical domain controller. Every domain controller has a file on the domain controller that holds the ntds.dit file. This file holds the Active Directory database. As shown here, there are 5 different partitions that are created by default when Active Directory is first installed. The data is divided up like this for organizational reasons and for replication. In this particular case, I'm going to be looking at only the application partition, since this holds the data that is used for DNS. Application partitions hold information that is used by a particular application. In the case of DNS, when you create an Active Directory integrated zone, the data for this zone is stored in the appropriate application partition. You did hear me correctly, the appropriate application partition. This can be as many application partitions as needed. The other partitions type are limited to 1 per database. I will now change to my Windows 8 computer with remote server administration tools to have a closer look at how the application partitions are used with DNS. First of all, I will open ADSI Edit to have a look at what exactly is stored in the database. To do this, I will open Charms by moving to the top right corner and then select Administrative Tools. Once Administrative Tools is open, the next step is to select the icon ADSI Edit. ADSI Edit is a low-level tool for editing the data in the Active Directory database. For making day-to-day changes to the Active Directory database, I would recommend using the Administrative Tools. ADSI Edit should only be used in rare troubleshooting cases, and in this case, I am only using ADSI Edit in order to have a better understanding of how Active Directory stores data, not to make changes. Once ADSI Edit has opened, I next need to connect to the Active Directory database. To do this, I need to right-click on ADSI Edit and select Connect To. To start with, under Select a well-known naming content, I will select the pull-down option Configuration. The configuration partition does not contain any DNS data. However, looking at it will give us a better understanding of how the Active Directory database is partitioned. For the configuration partition, I will expand down through Configuration until I get to Partitions. In here, you can see all the partitions that are created in Active Directory. At the bottom, you can see the standard partitions for the domain and forest created when Active Directory was first installed. Application partitions are named differently from the standard partitions. You can see above the standard partitions are the application partitions, which use an identifier rather than a standard name. Since there can be multiple application partitions, it is not possible to use a standard name, as each partition must have a unique name. If I select the first application partition, you will notice the name of the partition is Forest DNS Zones. DNS data that is stored with all domain controllers in the forest is stored in this application partition. Above this is the application partition for IT free training. This partition is shared with all domain controllers in the domain IT free training. If there were other domains, like child domains, then there would also be application partitions listed in here for those child domains. To have a look at the data in these application partitions, I will once again right-click on ADSI Edit and select Connect To, and this time I need to enter in the distinguished name for the application partition. In this case, I will connect to the Forest application partition. Once I have connected to Forest application partition, I can now see all the data that is stored at the forest level. To see the DNS data, I will expand down through the containers until I get to the Microsoft DNS container. Here you can see all the DNS data that is shared at the forest. In this case, notice that the zone highcosttraining.local is stored in here. High Cost Training, in this case, is not a child domain, but another company. In this case, High Cost Training has been configured as a stub zone, and thus this is why it appears in here. To see what DNS data is stored at the domain level, I need to use the connect to command once again, and this time connect to domain DNS zones using its distinguished name. Once connected, I will expand down to Microsoft DNS and then down to the container itfreetraining.local. In here you can see all the data for the IT Free Training Zone. Even though you could edit the data in here, it is recommended that you use the DNS Manager tool rather than edit the DNS data directly. If we now go back to Administrative Tools and open DNS Manager, I can expand down to the IT Free Training Zone and see the same data that I saw in ADSI Edit displayed in a friendlier format. If I now right-click the zone and open the properties, you can see that replication is currently configured to all domain controllers in the domain. If I press the Change button, I can change this to the option to all DNS servers running on domain controllers in this forest. Once I press OK and exit out of the properties, the changes to the zone data will be made. If I now go back to ADSI Edit and back to the domain application partition, notice that the itfreetraining.local partition is still here. However, when I press the F5 key to refresh the view, notice the partition disappears. If I select the forest application partition, notice once again the IT Free Training Zone is not visible. However, once again when I press F5, the missing zone appears. You should now understand how Active Directory keeps DNS records stored in the default partitions for domains and forests. Now I need to look at creating a custom partition to store DNS data in. To do this, I need to open a command prompt by opening Charms, selecting the search option, and then selecting the command prompt icon. The commands that I'm going to run I have placed in the batch file. The link to download the batch can be found in the description of this video, or you can view the commands in the description of this video if you prefer. I have stored the batch file on the flash drive, so I will now change to the flash drive and run the batch file. The first command that I will run is DNS command with the parameter enum directory partitions. This command will show all the current application partitions that are in the forest. Notice the first one is the domain application partition. The second one is the forest application partition. These are the only application partitions that are created by default when Active Directory is first set up. The next command that I will run with DNS command is to create an additional application partition. The first parameter is the domain controller I want to create the application partition on. The next parameter is create directory partition to tell DNS command that I want to create a partition. The last parameter is the name of the application partition that I want to create. You can use a short name here if you wish. In this case, I have used a fully qualified domain name to make it easy to recognize. Since I have made changes to the Active Directory configuration, I next will run a command to replicate the changes to all domain controllers. Otherwise, I need to wait until the next scheduled replication in Active Directory. If I scroll up to the top, you can see the command is repadmin with the parameter sync all, followed by the domain controller I want to run it on, and lastly the flags APED. In this case, it is important to make sure to use the same upper and lowercase characters, as the flags in this command are case sensitive. The flag uppercase A performs a sync of all name contents held in the domain controller. If you run this command without this flag, only the domain partition will be replicated. The change we just made was to the configuration partition, so the A flag is required. The flag uppercase P tells the domain controller to push the changes out to all other domain controllers rather than waiting for another domain controller to ask for changes. The E flag forces a sync of all domain controllers in the forest. In this case, since I have made changes to the configuration partition, which is forest-wide by adding an application partition, it is a good idea to add this flag. The D flag uses distinguished names in messages. This makes it easier to read the output from the command. Even though this command finished right away and with no errors, it is important to remember that this just requested a background replication to be performed. If you have a lot of data that needs to be replicated, it could take a while for the replication to finish. You will need to check the event viewer to see if replication has completed. Since I have made changes to partitions in Active Directory, the next command that I will run is repadmin with the parameter kcc followed by the domain controller nydc1. This forces the knowledge consistency checker, or KCC, to run on nydc1. The KCC creates the connections between domain controllers to ensure that data in each partition is correctly replicated. Since I have added a partition, it is a good idea to make sure these connections are made, otherwise the partition data may not get replicated. The KCC will run automatically by itself at set intervals, so just like the replication, you can wait for it to run or force it to run like I have. The next command does the same as the last command, except it causes the KCC to run on LADC1. The KCC uses the Active Directory database in order to make decisions about which connections to create. Thus, given the same Active Directory data, it should always make the same connections. For this reason, it is a good idea to always replicate the database like I have done before running the KCC. Currently, I only have the 2 sites, New York and Los Angeles, running. If I had more sites configured, I would need to run this command on one domain controller in each site. For the next command, I will run the replication command again. Since I have run the KCC and the connections may have changed, it is not a bad idea to run replication again. The next command I will run is DNS command again on the domain controller LADC1. Application partitions can be replicated to as many or few domain controllers as required. In this case, I want the data to be replicated to NYDC1 and LADC1. Since the application partition was created on NYDC1, the data will automatically be replicated to this domain controller. However, currently the data is not replicated to any other domain controllers. The next step that I want to do is add LADC1 to the replication list for this application partition. This is referred to as enlisting, so this command will enlist LADC1 to replicate the application partition that I have just created. This is done with the next parameter, enlist directory partition, followed by the application partition. This command needs to be run for every domain controller that you want this application partition to replicate with. This can be as many or few domain controllers as you want from any domain in the forest. Now that the application partition has been created, I can run the command DNS command followed by a domain controller, in this case NYDC1, and lastly the parameter enum directory partitions. This will show all the partitions in the forest. Notice the partition custom partition. Also notice this partition has been configured as enlisted. This means that domain controllers have to be manually added to it in order to receive changes, in contrast to the other two, which have domain controllers added automatically. Now that the application partition has been created, I will go back to DNS Manager and open the properties for the zone itfreetraining.local. Notice this time that when I press the button Change for replication, I now have the option at the bottom available to all domain controllers in the scope of this directory partition. This was not available before because there were no additional application partitions. In the pull-down list, notice I can select the custom partition that I just created. The data for the itfreetraining.local zone can now be stored in this partition if required. On most networks, you would not have the need to do this. However, on some networks, for additional security, an administrator may use this feature. There has been a lot covered in this video, so I will do a quick summary. An application partition holds data for any application. The application partition type is used by Microsoft DNS. This video has focused on using the application partition for DNS. However, it can also be used for non-Microsoft applications. The methods used in the video apply not only to DNS, but also if you were using an application partition with other software. Unlike the other partitions, once you create a custom application partition, you can decide which domain controllers the data stored in this application partition will be replicated to. This can be from one domain controller, that is, no replication performed, to all domain controllers, to anywhere in between. The domain controllers you choose can be any domain controllers in the forest. You are not limited to only choosing domain controllers in the same domain. By default, when Active Directory is installed, there is one application partition created for the forest and one application partition created for each domain in the forest. This is used to store Microsoft DNS data, but can also be used to store other data from other applications. That concludes this video. I hope you have found this video useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the other videos from IT Free Training. Thanks, and see you next time.